Twice I corrected it. The third time, I just let her, and I started doing the math in my head. We were standing near the ice sculpture, a ridiculously ornate swan that was slowly weeping freezing water onto the crushed ivory velvet tablecloth. A tablecloth I had paid $14 a yard to rent because my sister Chloe insisted that standard white linen would ruin the aesthetic of her winter wonderland reception, and she was introducing me to her new husband's extended family. The first time it happened, she was speaking to Julian's great-aunt, a woman draped in aggressively loud floral prints, and Chloe smiled her perfectly practiced, veneers-flashing influencer smile, gesturing vaguely in my direction with her champagne flute and saying, "And this is Marcus. He's a friend of the family who helped us out with the seating arrangements today." I felt a cold spike of disbelief hit the back of my neck, but I politely extended my hand, smiled a tight, controlled smile, and said, "I'm her older brother, Marcus, actually, and it's a pleasure to meet you." Chloe's eye twitched, just a millimeter of a spasm, before she laughed it off, claiming she was just so overwhelmed by the sheer volume of guests that her brain was short-circuiting. The second time it happened, not 20 minutes later, she was introducing me to Julian's former fraternity brothers, a group of loud, red-faced men holding scotch glasses, and she referred to me as the logistics guy who made sure the catering trucks arrived on time. Again, I stepped forward, my voice dropping an octave into the tone I usually reserve for hostile negotiations, and corrected her, stating clearly that I was her brother. She shot me a glare that could have stripped paint off a wall, a look of pure, unadulterated embarrassment, as if my very existence in my bespoke Tom Ford suit was somehow a stain on her curated high society illusion. But the third time, standing by that melting swan, she introduced me to Julian's mother's country club friends as my father's assistant Marcus, who was kind enough to run errands for us this weekend. I didn't correct her. I said nothing. I just looked at her, really looked at her, observing the way she avoided my eyes, the way she physically leaned away from me, the way she was actively trying to erase our blood relation to elevate her own perceived status among these people who didn't actually care about her, and I just let her. I let the silence hang there for a long, heavy moment, a silence that landed in the room like a physical weight, and then I simply nodded at the country club women, turned on my heel, and started doing the math in my head. Let me back up. I need to explain exactly how we got to a point where my own sister was treating me like a dirty secret at a wedding that I was entirely, secretly, and exclusively funding. I need to explain the mechanics of the delusion that led to this moment. I am 36 years old, and I own and operate Apex Freight Solutions, a regional logistics and supply chain management firm that I built from the ground up, starting when I was 19 years old with a single, battered 2004 Freightliner box truck and a relentless, exhausting drive to never rely on anyone else for my survival. My parents were, and still are, masters of maintaining appearances, people who would happily take out a third mortgage just to ensure the neighbors saw a new Mercedes in the driveway, people who believed that image was not just everything, but the only thing. Chloe, who is 7 years younger than me, was the golden child, the perfect, photogenic daughter who absorbed their toxic philosophy like a sponge, growing up to become a lifestyle consultant and micro-influencer, a career that essentially consisted of posting heavily filtered photographs of avocado toast and gifted skincare products while generating absolutely zero actual taxable income. I moved out the day I turned 18, tired of the constant, suffocating pressure to conform to their fake country club lifestyle, and I went into a blue-collar industry that they found actively repulsive. For years, they spoke of me in hushed, apologetic tones, as if my building a multi-million-dollar transportation fleet was somehow less respectable than Chloe's unpaid internships at boutique PR firms. We lived entirely separate lives, speaking only at mandatory holiday dinners where I would sit quietly, eating my dry turkey, while they bragged about Chloe's fabricated successes. But reality has a funny way of catching up with people who live on credit, and 14 months ago, the House of Cards finally collapsed. I received a frantic, tearful phone call from my father on a random Tuesday afternoon, begging me to come to their house in Oakbrook immediately. When I arrived, the scene was pathetic. My father was pacing the floor, his face gray, and my mother was sitting on the pristine white linen sofa, sobbing quietly into a silk handkerchief. They had hit the wall. The second mortgage was in default, the 4 credit cards were maxed out at a combined $84,000 with APRs hovering around 24%, and a disastrous, completely unresearched investment in a strip mall development had wiped out their remaining liquid savings. They were, legally and practically, bankrupt. And the timing, as my mother wailed, was catastrophic, because Chloe had just gotten engaged to Julian, a junior vice president at a wealth management firm, a man whose family actually possessed the generational wealth that my parents had spent 3 decades pretending to have. Chloe had already started planning a wedding that was meant to be her grand coronation into high society, a wedding that my parents had promised to pay for, a promise they made knowing full well they didn't have a dime to their names. They begged me. They sat across from me at their expensive, unpaid-for dining table and begged me to save them, to save Chloe's reputation, to fund the wedding so that Julian's family wouldn't realize they were marrying into a family of financial frauds. I sat there looking at these people who had spent my entire adult life minimizing my achievements because I got my hands dirty, and I felt a strange, cold detachment. I didn't say yes immediately. I told them I needed to think about it, I needed to look at the numbers, hours, and I left them sweating for 3 days. When I finally agreed, I didn't do it out of love, and I certainly didn't do it out of a sense of familial duty. I did it because I saw an opportunity to finally establish the undeniable truth of our dynamic, to force them to acknowledge reality. But I am a businessman, and I do not hand over blank checks. I scheduled a meeting with my corporate attorney, Robert Vance, a 58-year-old man with 22 years of experience in ruthless corporate litigation, a man whose suits were as gray as his morality, and who viewed contracts not as agreements, but as structural traps waiting to be sprung. I sat in his mahogany-paneled office and explained the situation. I told him I was going to fund my sister's wedding, which was estimated to cost around $115,000, but I was not going to give the money to my parents, nor was I going to give it to Chloe. I was going to pay the vendors directly through a dedicated limited liability company I set up specifically for this event, named Eventide Holdings LLC. Robert, peering over his reading glasses, smiled a thin, bloodless smile and began drafting what would become a 42-page funding agreement. This contract was a masterpiece of conditional financing. It stipulated that Eventide Holdings would cover the approved invoices for the venue, the catering, the dress, the floral arrangements, and the entertainment, but it included several incredibly specific performance clauses. The most important of these was Section 4, Paragraph B, Subsection 2, which we casually referred to as the Good Faith and Respect Clause. It explicitly stated that the funding was contingent upon the continued good faith, respect, and public acknowledgement of the financier by the beneficiaries, and that any actions deemed to publicly humiliate, diminish, or misrepresent the financier would constitute a material breach of the agreement, granting Eventide Holdings the immediate, unilateral right to revoke all pending, uncleared, or future funding, and to immediately call in the expended funds as a high-interest loan. I presented this contract to my parents and Chloe at my office, sitting behind my desk, flanked by Robert Vance and my CFO, Sarah Jenkins, a 42-year-old forensic accountant who had spent 17 years tracking hidden assets and who looked at my family with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a petri dish. Chloe threw a massive tantrum, of course. She screamed, she cried, she accused me of trying to control her special day, of being a manipulative sociopath, of trying to ruin her life. She demanded that I just wire the money to her personal account and trust her. I simply slid the contract across the desk, handed her a Mont Blanc pen, and said, "These are the terms. You sign it and you get the Winter Wonderland wedding at the Botanical Glass House. You don't sign it and you can explain to Julian's family why you're getting married at the local VFW hall with a cash bar." The silence that followed was absolute. My parents, terrified of exposure, pressured her, whispering furiously in her ear, and eventually, with a shaking hand and a look of pure hatred, she signed it. My parents signed as guarantors, and so the machine was set in motion. Over the next 8 months, I became the silent, invisible engine powering the illusion of Chloe's perfect life. I paid the $22,000 deposit for the Botanical Glass House. I paid the $14,000 invoice for her custom silk organza gown. I paid the $12,000 floral bill to Sylvia Vance, a 45-year-old florist who imported white peonies directly from Holland at $45 a stem. I paid for the catering by Chef Antoine, a 52-year-old culinary prima donna who charged $185 a plate for 250 guests. And throughout all of this, Chloe's behavior began to subtly, then overtly, escalate in its cruelty and entitlement. She started telling her bridesmaids and her Instagram followers that the wedding was being sponsored by several luxury brands she was collaborating with, completely erasing my involvement. When it came time for the rehearsal dinner, an event I had also paid for, she called me the night before and suggested, in a voice dripping with fake concern, that I might feel out of place among Julian's sophisticated friends, and that I didn't have to come if I didn't want to. I told her I would be there, and I went, sitting quietly at a corner table while she paraded around, introducing Julian's family to everyone but me. The morning of the wedding, the disrespect crystallized into physical reality. When I arrived at the venue wearing a suit that cost more than the entire catering deposit, the usher, a college kid with a clipboard, couldn't find my name on the VIP family list. He finally located me on the general admission list. When I walked into the reception space to check the layout, I found my place card. I was not seated at the head table. I was not seated at the family tables near the dance floor. I was seated at table 19, a small cramped table located directly behind a massive structural pillar, right next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, seated alongside the venue's event staff and the backup photographer. It was a deliberate, calculated insult, a physical manifestation of where she believed I belonged in her life. I didn't complain. I didn't cause a scene. I simply sat down, ate my $185 plate of dry sea bass, and watched the performance. Which brings us back to the reception, back to the ice swan, back to the third introduction. My father's assistant, Marcus. As I walked away from her, the math in my head was finalizing. The total expenditure to date was $112,250.40. But because of the way Robert Vance had structured the payments, deliberately leveraging the standard operating procedures of high-end wedding vendors, the final 30% of the venue fee, the entirety of the open bar tab, and the final payment for the catering were not due until 9:00 p.m. on the night of the event. It was currently 8:15 p.m. The funds were sitting in an escrow account controlled by Eventide Holdings, waiting for my final authorization to to be released. I walked calmly, purposefully, out of the main reception hall, the thumping bass of the $10,000 live band vibrating through the floorboards, and made my way down the quiet, carpeted hallway to the venue's administrative office. I knocked once and entered. Sitting behind the desk was Eleanor Thorne, the 48-year-old venue manager who had spent 15 years navigating the hysterical demands of wealthy brides, a woman who possessed a demeanor of glacial professionalism. She looked up from her monitor, surprised to see a guest in the back office. I closed the door behind me, sat down in the leather guest chair, pulled my phone from my pocket, and opened the digital dossier I had been compiling for 8 months. "Eleanor," I said, my voice perfectly level. "My name is Marcus. I am the sole managing member of Eventide Holdings LLC, the entity that is currently funding the event in your main hall." She blinked, her professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second as she recognized the name of the company on all her invoices. "Yes, Mr. Marcus, I'm aware. Is there an issue with the service?" I smiled, a tight, humorless expression. "The service is excellent, Eleanor. The issue is with the client. I am triggering the breach of contract clause in our funding agreement with the bride. Effective immediately, Eventide Holdings is revoking all pending financial authorizations for this event." Eleanor stared at me, the color draining slightly from her face as the implications of what I was saying hit her. She was a professional. She knew exactly what this meant. "Mr. Marcus, the final balances for the venue, the catering, and the bar are scheduled to auto-draft in 45 minutes. If you revoke authorization, the payments will bounce, and per our standard policy, all services must immediately cease." I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a physical copy of the contract, and slid it across her desk, tapping my finger on Section 4, Paragraph B. "I am aware of your policy, Eleanor. That is why I am here. I am formally instructing you to halt the auto-draft. I am closing the open bar tab on my corporate American Express. I am pulling the plug." She looked down at the contract, then back up at me, her eyes wide. "You're shutting down your own sister's wedding in the middle of the reception?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I am terminating a breached financial agreement," I corrected her calmly. "What happens in the main hall is no longer my concern. I suggest you inform your staff." I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of the office, leaving her staring at the paperwork in stunned silence. I didn't go back into the reception hall. I walked out to the venue's sprawling outdoor terrace, lit by hundreds of fairy lights I had paid for, and leaned against the stone balustrade, lighting a cigar and waiting for the cascade of consequences to begin. It didn't take long. At exactly 8:34 p.m., the music abruptly stopped in the middle of a song, creating a jarring, echoing silence that washed over the 250 guests. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, I watched the scene unfold with total detachment. I saw the bartender, a young guy in a black vest, physically place a plastic cover over the beer taps and begin loudly pulling bottles of liquor off the back bar, packing them into cardboard boxes. I saw the catering staff, who had been in the middle of serving the dessert course, suddenly stop, turn around, and wheel the dessert carts back into the kitchen, the swinging doors slamming shut behind them. The guests were looking around in confusion, murmuring to each other, holding empty glasses, waiting for a punchline that wasn't coming. And then I saw Chloe. She was standing near the dance floor, her face a mask of absolute panic, frantically waving her arms at the bandleader, who was currently packing his saxophone into its velvet-lined case. Julian was beside her, looking bewildered, holding his phone to his ear. A moment later, Eleanor Thorne, flanked by two large, imposing security guards, walked purposefully onto the dance floor and approached Chloe and Julian. I couldn't hear what she was saying through the thick glass, but I didn't need to. I watched Eleanor hand Chloe a printed piece of paper, the notice of payment failure, and I watched Chloe's knees literally buckle. Julian grabbed her arm to steady her, his face turning bright red as he began arguing with Eleanor. But Eleanor simply shook her head, pointed to the contract, and gestured toward the exits. The venue was shutting down. The party was over. Chloe spun around, her eyes scanning the room frantically, desperately searching for the one person she had spent the entire evening trying to hide. She spotted me through the glass, standing on the terrace, smoking my cigar, her face contorted into an expression of pure, unhinged rage, and she hiked up her $14,000 dress and stormed toward the terrace doors, Julian and my parents trailing closely behind her in a panicked cluster. She slammed the glass doors open, marching out into the freezing night air, her breath looming in white clouds. "What did you do?" she shrieked, her voice cracking, her influencer poise completely shattered. "What the hell did you just do, Marcus?" I took a slow drag from my cigar, exhaled a thick cloud of smoke, and looked at her. "I did the math, Chloe," I said, my voice deadpan, completely devoid of emotion. "You're cutting off the bar?" she screamed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her professional makeup. "I'm cutting off everything," I replied. "The bar, the venue, the catering, the band. You breached the contract, Chloe. Section 4, Paragraph B. You failed to maintain good faith and respect. You introduced me as your father's assistant. You seated me by the kitchen. You treated the sole financier of your fantasy life like an embarrassment. So, the financing has been revoked." Julian stepped forward, puffing out his chest, trying to play the protective husband. "Listen here, pal. I don't know what kind of sick power trip you're on, but you can't just ruin our wedding because your feelings got hurt. Do you know who my family is?" I looked at Julian, feeling a brief flash of pity for the idiot. "Julian," I said calmly, "I don't care who your family is. What I care about is the $112,000 I have spent propping up the illusion that your new wife and her parents have a single dime to to their names. They are bankrupt, Julian. They are living on maxed out credit cards and a defaulted mortgage. I paid for this entire circus because they begged me to save them from the humiliation of you finding out they are broke. But since I am apparently just the hired help, the help is clocking out. The silence that fell over the terrace was absolute. Julian slowly turned his head to look at Chloe, who was trembling violently, her face pale as a sheet. He looked at my parents, who were staring at the ground, unable to meet his eyes. The truth had finally been dragged out into the cold, harsh light, and there was nowhere left to hide. "Is it true?" Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper, staring at Chloe. She opened her mouth to speak, to spin another lie, to deflect and manipulate, but no words came out. She just let out a pathetic, choked sob. I didn't wait around for the rest of the domestic dispute. I dropped my cigar on the stone patio, crushed it out with the heel of my shoe, and walked past them, back through the glass doors, through the chaotic, murmuring crowd of guests who were being actively herded toward the coat check by the security staff, and walked out the front doors to my waiting car. The cascade of consequences over the next 48 hours was rapid, brutal, and entirely documented. Because I had revoked the final payments, the vendors immediately moved to collections against the signatories of the contract, Chloe and my parents. The following morning, at 9 a.m. sharp, Robert Vance filed the paperwork to officially convert the previously expended funds, the deposits, the dress, the flowers, into a high-interest, callable loan, as stipulated in the breach clause. I also logged into the travel portal and canceled the first-class flights to the Maldives and the 2-week stay at the Overwater bungalow that I had booked for their honeymoon using my corporate reward points. They found out about the cancellation when they were standing at the Emirates check-in counter at O'Hare Airport, surrounded by their luggage, being told by the ticketing agent that their reservation no longer existed. The social fallout was catastrophic. Julian's family, upon discovering the full extent of the financial deception, immediately initiated annulment proceedings. Julian moved out of their shared apartment within 3 days. My parents, entirely exposed and completely broke, were forced to put the Oak Brook house on the market at a massive loss just to avoid foreclosure, and they moved into a small, rented townhouse in a suburb they used to actively mock. As for Chloe, her carefully curated social media empire crumbled overnight. Guests from the wedding, furious at being kicked out into the cold without dinner, took to Instagram and TikTok, posting videos of the bartender packing up the liquor and Eleanor Thorne shutting down the dance floor. The rumor mill churned, the truth leaked out, and Chloe's brand sponsorships dried up faster than the melting ice swan. She attempted to post a tearful, victim narrative video claiming she had been financially abused by a toxic family member, but the internet is undefeated, and within hours, someone had leaked the reality of the situation, exposing her as a fraud who tried to hide the brother paying her bills. She went private, then deactivated her accounts entirely. 6 months later, my life is incredibly peaceful. Apex Freight Solutions just acquired a smaller competitor, expanding our fleet to 65 trucks. I bought a new house, a sprawling modern property on a lake, far away from the toxic, image-obsessed world my family inhabits. I haven't spoken to my parents or my sister since the night of the wedding, and I have no intention of ever doing so again. Robert Vance handles all communication regarding the repayment of the loan, which is being slowly, painfully garnished from whatever meager wages they manage to scrape together. Sometimes, when I am sitting on my back deck, drinking a glass of scotch and looking out at the calm water, I think back to that moment standing by the ice sculpture. I think about the sheer audacity of her entitlement, the absolute blindness of her shame. I think about how hard she tried to bury my generosity under a mountain of her own insecurity. But the thing about generosity is that when it's documented, notarized, and legally binding, it doesn't stay buried for long. Twice I corrected it. The third time, I just let the math do the talking.